There is a truth that has been kept hidden in plain sight for millennia, woven into the very fabric of existence itself. This truth is not found in distant temples or sacred rituals, but within the consciousness of every human being who has ever walked the earth. In the lessons learned from reading the works of Neville Goddard, this revelation emerges with startling clarity. Divinity is not something external to be worshipped or begged for, but the very essence of what each person is. How many souls spend entire lifetimes seeking God in the heavens while never recognizing the creative power breathing within their own awareness? The journey begins when this recognition finally awakens. Humanity has been conditioned to see itself as small, powerless, separate from the divine source of all creation. Religious traditions have often taught that God is far away, watching from above, judging from a distance. Yet this teaching contradicts the deepest spiritual truths that have been whispered through the ages. When someone truly understands that consciousness is the only reality, everything shifts. The external world is not the cause of experience, but the effect of an inner state that most have never been taught to master. This is not blasphemy or arrogance. This is the forgotten science of being. The concept of being God in human form sounds shocking to ears trained in separation and unworthiness. Yet what else could explain the creative power of imagination? What else could account for the way thoughts and feelings become things, the way inner states crystallize into outer circumstances? In the lessons learned from reading the works of Neville Goddard, this principle is laid bare with precision. Assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled, and the world must conform. This is not metaphor. This is mechanism. The same mechanism through which worlds are created and sustained operates within human consciousness every single moment. Most people live as if life happens to them, as if they are victims of external forces beyond their control. They pray to a God outside themselves, hoping for intervention, waiting for salvation. But what if the very act of waiting perpetuates the experience of lack? What if the divine power they seek is not listening from afar, but is the very awareness through which they listen, see, and feel? The shift from seeking to being is the greatest transformation available to human consciousness. It requires nothing more than recognizing what has always been true. The kingdom is within. The power is here. The divinity is now. Consider how a mirror reflects only what stands before it, never questioning, never resisting, always faithful to what it receives. Human consciousness works in exactly this way, mirroring back the states habitually occupied within. When someone dwells in limitation, the mirror shows limitation. When someone assumes abundance, the mirror reflects abundance. This is not magical thinking or wishful fantasy. This is the spiritual law that governs all manifestation. In the lessons learned from reading the works of Neville Goddard, this law is called the law of assumption, and it operates with absolute precision. Once this is understood, the question becomes, what state is being assumed right now, and is it worthy of divinity? The law of assumption reveals that consciousness is not a passive observer of reality, but the active creator of every experience. This is where most spiritual teachings fall short, offering prayer without power, hope without method, faith without understanding. When someone assumes a state internally and persists in that assumption, the external world has no choice but to reorganize itself to match. This is not a reward for good behavior or a gift from an external deity. This is the natural consequence of being the operant power in one's own life. The divine does not create for anyone. The divine creates as everyone. Bruce Lipton's research in epigenetics confirms what mystics have known for ages. Perception controls biology, and belief shapes cellular expression. The environment does not control the cell's perception of the environment does. Apply this same principle to human life, and the implications become staggering. If perception is primary and environment is secondary, then changing the inner state is not just spiritual practice, it is scientific necessity. The body, the circumstances, the relationships, the finances, all of these are effects, not causes. The cause is always consciousness. The cause is always the assumption held within. How many years have been spent trying to change the outer world without ever addressing the inner state that creates it? How much effort has been wasted pushing against conditions, fighting circumstances, resisting what is? The exhaustion that comes from this approach is not a sign of bad luck or divine punishment. It is the natural result of working against the law instead of with it. In the lessons learned from reading the works of Neville Goddard, this becomes abundantly clear. Change the state, and the world must follow. Not because of effort, but because of alignment. Not because of struggle, but because of assumption. The vast majority of people live from a state of wanting, wishing, hoping that things will change. But wanting implies lack. Wishing implies absence. Hoping implies uncertainty. None of these states contain the fulfillment that manifestation requires. To assume the state of the wish fulfilled means to feel now what would be felt if the desire were already accomplished. This is not pretending. This is not positive thinking covering up negative belief. This is occupying a state so completely that the old reality has no choice but to dissolve and the new one to emerge. The key is not in the doing, but in the being. Consider the ocean, vast and deep, with waves rising and falling on its surface. The waves are not separate from the ocean. They are temporary expressions of its movement. In the same way, individual experiences are not separate from consciousness. They are temporary expressions of its assumption. When the ocean is calm, the waves are gentle. When the ocean is turbulent, the waves are violent. The surface reflects the depth. The external reflects the internal. Understanding this dissolves the illusion of powerlessness and reveals the truth. What is assumed within must be expressed without. This is law. This is divinity. This is the power that has always been present. The tragedy is not that human beings lack power, but that they have been taught to forget it. From childhood, most are conditioned to believe that authority resides outside themselves, in governments, institutions, experts, circumstances. The message is always the same: adapt to the world, fit into the mold, accept what is given. But this teaching is a betrayal of the deepest truth. No one is here to adapt to a world that does not serve them. Everyone is here to create a world that reflects their highest vision. This is not rebellion. This is responsibility. This is the divine function of consciousness. In the lessons learned from reading the works of Neville Goddard, there is a persistent emphasis on the phrase, I am. These two words are not casual language. They are the name of God, the creative force itself. Whatever follows, I am, becomes the reality experienced. I am powerless, creates powerlessness. I am abandoned, creates abandonment. I am worthy, creates worthiness. I am abundant, creates abundance. The world does not argue with what is claimed in consciousness. It simply delivers the evidence to match. How often has someone unknowingly claimed limitation and then wondered why limitation persists? The contrast between unconscious creation and conscious creation is the difference between suffering and mastery. Unconscious creators react to the world, letting external conditions dictate their internal state. Conscious creators choose their internal state regardless of external conditions, knowing that the external must eventually conform. One approach leads to victimhood, the other to divinity. One approach leads to endless cycles of struggle, the other to effortless manifestation. The choice is always available, but it requires recognizing that consciousness is the foundation upon which all experience is built. What would change if someone truly accepted that they are God in human form, not metaphorically, but literally? What if the imagination is not a mental escape, but the very workshop of creation itself? What if every feeling, every assumption, every state of being is a command issued to the universe? The implications are so vast that the mind initially resists them. It feels safer to remain small, to defer power to something outside. But safety in smallness is an illusion. There is no safety in denying divinity. There is only the prolonged suffering of living beneath one's true nature. The ones who awaken to this truth do not become arrogant or reckless. They become gentle, compassionate, deeply responsible. Because once it is understood that consciousness creates reality, blame dissolves. Victimhood dissolves. Resentment dissolves. What remains is the pure recognition that every experience is self-created, and therefore every experience can be recreated. This is not a burden. This is liberation. This is the return to the throne that was never truly abandoned, only forgotten. The power has always been here. The divinity has always been present. The question is, will it finally be claimed? In the Gospel of John, chapter 10, verse 34, there is a passage that most have read but few have truly understood. The words are clear and unmistakable. Is it not written in your law, I said, ye are gods? This is not poetic language or symbolic metaphor meant to inspire from a distance. This is a direct statement about the nature of human consciousness and its relationship to divinity. When examined through the lessons learned from reading the works of Neville Goddard, this verse becomes a confirmation of the law of assumption itself. It declares that divinity is not reserved for a distant being in the sky, but is the very essence of every individual who has ever existed. The phrase, "Ye are gods," is not a compliment or an aspiration. It is a factual description of what consciousness is. If God is the creator of all things, and consciousness is what creates the experience of reality, then consciousness itself must be divine. There is no separation between the creator and the creation except in belief. In the lessons learned from reading the works of Neville Goddard, this truth is explored with surgical precision. Imagination is God, and imagination resides within every human being. To imagine is to create. To assume is to command. To feel is to manifest. This is not theology. This is mechanics. Yet how many people live in pain, believing they are powerless, unworthy, separate from the divine source they desperately seek? The tragedy is not in the circumstances themselves, but in the misunderstanding of where power truly resides. Someone can pray for hours, begging for relief, never realizing that the one being petitioned is the very consciousness doing the praying. The external God is a reflection of the internal state. When the internal state changes, the reflection changes. This is why faith without assumption produces no results. Faith directed outward is hope. Faith directed inward is creation. This biblical verse also addresses the objection that arises when this truth is spoken, the accusation of blasphemy. Yet the text itself refutes this accusation by quoting divine law. If Scripture declares, "Ye are gods," then claiming divinity is not rebellion, it is recognition. The real blasphemy is denying the creative power within and living in victimhood, limitation, and separation. The real sin is refusing to accept responsibility for the reality being experienced. In the lessons learned from reading the works of Neville Goddard, sin is redefined as missing the mark, failing to assume the state that would produce the desired outcome. Redemption is simply choosing a new assumption. When this truth is finally accepted, not intellectually, but viscerally, the entire foundation of life transforms. The waiting ends. The begging ends. The searching ends. What remains is the simple, powerful recognition that divinity has always been present, always been active, always been creating through the assumptions held in consciousness. The question is no longer, how do I reach God? But, what am I assuming as God right now? This shift is not subtle. It is total. It is the difference between living as a beggar and living as a king. It is the difference between powerlessness and absolute creative authority. Awakening to the truth of being God in human form does not mean life becomes effortless or that all challenges disappear. It means that challenges are no longer seen as external obstacles, but as reflections of internal states that can be revised. Responsibility becomes total, and with that responsibility comes absolute freedom. No longer is there a need to wait for permission, validation, or approval from any external source. The authority to create, to change, to manifest resides entirely within the one experiencing life. This is not arrogance. This is clarity. Consider someone who has spent years feeling unworthy of love, assuming rejection before it even arrives. That assumption operates like a magnet, drawing experiences that confirm the unworthiness. Not because the universe is cruel, but because consciousness is faithful. It delivers precisely what is assumed. In the lessons learned from reading the works of Neville Goddard, the solution is not to fight the external evidence of rejection, but to assume the internal state of being deeply loved. To feel it now, not as a future hope, but as a present reality. When that state is occupied persistently, the external world has no choice but to reorganize and reflect it. The same principle applies to wealth, health, purpose, and every other dimension of life. Someone struggling financially while assuming lack will continue to experience lack, no matter how hard they work. But someone who assumes abundance, who feels the relief and satisfaction of financial freedom now, begins to move through a different reality. Opportunities appear. Resources emerge. Circumstances shift. Not because of luck or divine favor, but because the assumption has changed. The outer world is always a mirror of the inner state. Change the state, and the mirror shows something new. This is where most spiritual teachings falter. They focus on changing behavior without changing the state from which behavior arises. They prescribe actions, disciplines, rituals, hoping that doing will lead to being. But the law of assumption works in reverse. Being produces doing. State produces action. Consciousness produces circumstance. Trying to manifest from a state of lack is like planting seeds in barren soil and expecting a harvest. The soil must be prepared first. The state must be assumed first. Everything else follows naturally, effortlessly, inevitably. What if the entire purpose of life is to remember this truth and live from it fully? What if every challenge, every moment of suffering, every experience of lack is simply consciousness showing where an assumption needs to be revised? This reframe transforms pain from punishment into feedback, from curse into guidance. The divine within is not cruel, it is precise. It reflects exactly what is being assumed so that the assumption can be seen, examined, and changed. This is love in its highest form. This is grace operating through law. This is God teaching God how to create consciously. The existential weight of this truth cannot be understated. If consciousness is God, then every moment of life is an act of creation. There is no neutral ground, no passive observation, no innocent victimhood. Every thought, every feeling, every assumption is actively shaping the reality that will be experienced tomorrow, next week, next year. This is not meant to induce guilt or fear, but to awaken the profound responsibility that comes with divine power. The one who truly understands this stops blaming circumstances, stops waiting for rescue, stops living as if life is something that happens to them. They begin to live as life itself, creating deliberately, assuming consciously, manifesting intentionally. Consider the theater, where actors step onto a stage and become characters entirely different from who they are off stage. The actor is not the character, yet while on stage, they embody that role completely. In the same way, consciousness assumes states and becomes them temporarily, forgetting its true nature. The difference is that most people never step off stage. They remain trapped in a single character, believing it to be their permanent identity. In the lessons learned from reading the works of Neville Goddard, freedom comes from recognizing that any state can be assumed and any identity can be embodied. The stage is infinite. The roles are limitless. The only constraint is the refusal to step into a new character. This recognition transforms the relationship between mind, body, and spirit. The body is not a prison or a limitation. It is the instrument through which consciousness experiences its own creations. The mind is not an enemy to be silenced. It is the canvas upon which imagination paints. The spirit is not something to be sought in distant realms. It is the awareness reading these words right now. When these three are aligned in a single assumption, miracles become ordinary. Healing becomes natural. Manifestation becomes inevitable. The separation that creates suffering dissolves, and what remains is wholeness, unity, divinity expressing itself through human form. Yet the call is not to become something new, but to remember what has always been true. No one needs to earn divinity or achieve worthiness. These are already present, already complete, already functioning. The only task is to stop denying them. To stop living from lack when abundance is the natural state. To stop seeking love when love is the very fabric of existence. To stop begging for power when power is the essence of consciousness itself. This shift is not gradual or earned through years of discipline. It can happen in an instant, the moment the old assumption is released and a new one is claimed. The transition from unconscious creation to conscious creation is the birth of a new human being, not in body, but in awareness. Everything looks the same externally, yet everything feels different internally. There is peace where there was anxiety. There is certainty where there was doubt. There is creative joy where there was passive resignation. The world does not change first. The state changes first. And then, quietly, inevitably, the world begins to rearrange itself to match the new assumption. This is not fantasy. This is the forgotten science of being that every mystic, every saint, every awakened one has pointed toward throughout history. For those ready to step into this truth consciously, there is a practice that serves as a bridge between the old assumption and the new. It requires no tools, no special location, no external validation, only the willingness to use imagination as the divine faculty it truly is. In a quiet moment, when the noise of the world subsides, someone can close their eyes and construct a scene that implies the wish is already fulfilled. Not a scene of wanting or working toward, but a scene of having, of being, of completion. This scene is repeated in imagination until it feels natural, until it feels real, until the body responds as if it is happening now. The power of this practice lies not in the vividness of the imagery, but in the feeling it generates. Feeling is the secret, the bridge between assumption and manifestation. When someone feels the relief of financial freedom, the warmth of being loved, the satisfaction of purpose fulfilled, they are occupying the state from which those experiences arise. The external world, being a faithful mirror, has no choice but to reflect that state. In the lessons learned from reading the works of Neville Goddard, this is called living in the end, and it is the most direct path to conscious creation. It bypasses struggle, bypasses time, bypasses all the intermediate steps the logical mind insists are necessary. There is an invitation here, not just to understand this intellectually, but to test it experientially. To choose one desire, one wish, one version of reality that feels impossible from the current state, and to assume it is already done. To persist in that assumption despite external evidence to the contrary. To live from the end, feeling what would be felt if the wish were already fulfilled. This is not faith in an external God who may or may not grant the request. This is faith in the divinity within, which always delivers what is assumed. For those willing to engage with this channel and these teachings more deeply, subscribing and activating notifications ensures this wisdom continues to reach those ready to awaken. What would life look like if every decision, every action, every moment were lived from the recognition of being God in human form? What would change if the seeking stopped and the creating began? What would dissolve if responsibility were fully accepted and victimhood finally released? These are not rhetorical questions meant to inspire vague feelings. These are practical inquiries that lead to transformation when answered honestly. The world is not broken. The system is not rigged. The divine has not abandoned anyone. The only thing that has ever been missing is the recognition of what has always been present. The truth that opens this exploration is the same truth that closes it. Divinity is not a distant goal to be reached through years of spiritual striving, but the present reality of consciousness itself. Everyone is God in human form, creating constantly, manifesting faithfully, experiencing precisely what is assumed within. The teaching is not to become divine, but to stop pretending otherwise. The invitation is not to seek power, but to acknowledge the power that is already operating. And the deepest wisdom of all is this: the very awareness that questions, that seeks, that desires change is the divine source itself, looking through human eyes, ready to create a new world the moment a new assumption is claimed.